Bonjour. It's a great honour to welcome to the festival Sally Wainwright, one of the rare writers who's combined great popular success with critical acclaim. And this morning she's going to tell us how she does it. So, first question really is about being a writer who has so many opportunities. How do you filter those opportunities? How do you filter your own ideas and filter ideas that are brought to you? How do you choose the thing you want to do?
I think everything I write is quite personal. So I don't often get ideas brought to me because people tend to know that I don't do that. I think a couple of times people have asked me to do adaptations, and I think I'm just not very good at adaptations. I think it all needs to come from in here, so it's all really quite personal, even when it doesn't appear to be like something like the Bronte film. They tend to be ideas that I've had for a long, long time. When I break them down or analyse where they've come from, they tend to be ideas that I've had since childhood almost. Even something like Gentleman Jack. That's Shivden Hall has been part of my life since I was a child. So, and something like Last Tango as well. That goes back a long, long way. It's like stories my mum told me when I was little. So, I think all my work is from quite a deep, dark place. That's they've been germinating for a long time.
I hate adaptations too. If I was to kind of put it in a nutshell, it's that people bring you something and they've got some idea of what they want it to be. And so when you start working on it, you see that look on their face, which is, oh, we didn't think it was going to be like that. And then you just got to get out of that.
Have you ever done an adaptation?
Oh, God, yeah, never again. But I completely agree with you about that process of finding stuff within yourself, and kind of in terms of how you started in writing, what was that process? How did you develop into a writer?
Well, again, I don't know about you, but I was writing when I was like 7 and 8. I used to just write stories. Well, at school you write stories, don't you? At junior school you are required to be imaginative and write stories, and I feel like I just never grew out of that. I think at a certain age you become self-conscious that it's a bit silly. It's like playing. When you're little, you play. You make stuff up, you make stories up with your friends, and you're not embarrassed to play. And I think writers are people who want to continue playing, but they realise you can't do that in public because it's embarrassing. So you start doing it in your head and writing it all down. So I think, again, it's something from quite deep inside you that I think it's a compulsion, writing. I think it comes from something very personal. And I don't remember a time when I didn't write. I think there was a moment when I realised you could make a living out of it, which is a slightly different thing. But I think I've always also been attracted to dialogue rather than trying to write a novel or poetry or whatever. It's for some reason, to me, dialogue always felt more alive. It felt more vibrant. It felt like you were actually recreating real people, that you were actually recreating reality. Because once you've written dialogue, it goes on to another stage of real people coming along to perform it. So it just had that extra level of excitement that prose, for me, didn't always have.
So what made you want to be a TV writer? I know you just talked about dialogue and so on, but was it the fact that you were influenced by watching TV and that felt like the medium you had a connection with?
Absolutely. As a child, I was like a compulsive TV viewer. I would just watch anything and everything. To the point where your parents were actually worried about you. But again, I wasn't a great reader as a child, so I much preferred seeing stories rather than actually reading them. But I also think at an early age, I realised that I was very excited by performance. I love watching actors act. I find it really exciting. The process of actually seeing other human beings recreating reality just does something to me that I find deeply energising. So yeah, I love being part of, that's why I wanted to direct. I love being part of that process. I don't quite get writers who don't want to direct. I think I write to see that next stage where people actually bring it to life.
So it feels like it's quite a common sort of working class British experience that you are more exposed to TV as an influence than the theatre, even though we have a very strong theatre industry. Did you ever go and see plays or want to write for the theatre, or was it always that when you imagined being a writer and what you were creating, it would be in the format of a TV series?
No, I did start wanting to write for theatre. Again, it's something about performance, and the more live that performance is, the better. So I was very excited by the prospect of theatre. I didn't go to the theatre till I was about 13 because it was just something my family didn't do. It wasn't a cultural event. Neither was going to the cinema, actually. And I grew up not very film conscious at all. I only became film conscious as an adult because my husband is very filmy. He loves film. He loves going to see film. But as a child, I remember going to the cinema about 3 times, which is weird, isn't it? But that's the way it was then. I don't think my parents could afford. I mean, they could afford, but it wasn't a priority to afford either film or theatre. So I think the first time I went to the theatre was when I was 13, and I instantly knew that it was my thing. It was exciting, and I think my early attempts at writing were for stage, even though I had a passion for telly. And then when I started to write professionally, there were just so many more opportunities, it seemed, to write TV rather than stage, and that's the way it went. But I'd still love to write a stage show. I'd love to write a play. But I've just never had the opportunity to, or the time now, really.
Yeah.
To go that way.
Yeah. So, were you like one of those classic people who watched Coronation Street and then wanted to write for it?
Yeah. At the age of 13, I wanted to write Coronation Street.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
But I think I was 30 when I actually did.
Yeah, I remember the first time I ever attended a television event. I was completely starstruck by seeing Ken Barlow. It was like, oh my God! It was like, it doesn't matter. He could have had Julia Roberts standing next to him. It would be like, no, God, someone from Coronation Street. Yeah. So at the moment, Gentleman Jack is playing on the BBC, and it's the number 1 rated drama on British television currently, and getting fantastic reviews. So let's have a little look at Sally's latest work. This is our first clip from Gentleman Jack. It's ironic we're in France and it's the French that gets subtitled. Great green screen there as well. I thought that actually looked like she was on a hill with those woods down there. It looks fantastic. I mean, it's beautifully composed shots, and in terms of the genesis of the project, which we'll talk about in a second, I just wondered, in terms of your process, that is so visual. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about when you're sitting in that lonely room facing the computer screen, what's going on in your head that leads to what goes onto the screen?
I do always think very visually. So I do tend to think, particularly openings like that, I think, as in life, it's true in drama that you only get one chance to make a first impression. So that when you introduce a new character, a big new character, well, any character actually, the tiniest character, but certainly when you introduce a major new character like Anne Lister, you've got to say something very big, and you've got to say more than one thing. You've got to say about 7 things about her in one fell swoop. And so I think visually, again, that's why I always wanted to direct, was that when I do write the scripts, I see it in my head very clearly. it's kind of all there. And for me, it's just about getting that all down on paper. And but I do think very long and hard about how to certainly how to open a series. I mean, I'm sure we all do, but for me, it's always been a very visual experience, just sitting at my desk on my own. But there's a huge number of images that I want to try and explain in the stage directions, which of course you can't always do, because it's bad form to tell a director how to do it in your stage directions. So you kind of try to avoid doing that. But at the same time, you want to convey what is there in your head. I knew I was going to direct this, so I kind of didn't have to write any stage directions at all. For me, a huge part of the process is thinking about the visual impact that any scene will have, however big or small. I mean, that's a huge example of a big impact. But yeah.
Great. I mean, I think what's really interesting is the way that you have now become a writer-director. You've hyphenated yourself, Sally. So, in terms of Gentleman Jack, you just said that you knew you were going to direct it. How does that change the process for you in terms of not just what you put on the page? I know you said you maybe were more sparing with action directions in the script, but also how does that change your relationship to the production team and the editorial input that you get?
It hasn't changed it massively, because I think I was always aware of how things have to be done. I think it's changed it in more subtle ways. So as I write, I am very conscious of exactly how will we achieve this and which departments will need to be involved, whereas I might not have thought about that before. And since I've begun directing, I've always consciously thought, is this directable? Is this actable? Is this achievable? And in fact, that scene you've just seen was one where once I'd written it and sent it off, I still didn't know how the hell we were going to do it. But that's where having a fantastic team kicks in, and interviewing DOPs, because it was one of the DOPs I interviewed who wasn't actually the DOP I ended up with, who suggested using a Russian arm to shoot that scene, which I'd never used before. And to be honest, I didn't even know what one was. But I do now.
I think that's just the classic DOP thing of naming the most expensive piece of kit. It's like, I've lost count of the number of Russian arm conversations that we've had in a production, which have then been budgeted, and you just look at the numbers and go, no, we're not going to be able to do that. So great, congratulations for actually succeeding. Afterwards, you'll have to tell me how you managed to wangle that.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's expensive. I mean, that sequence took 2 days to shoot. Yeah,
I mean, it looks like a very logistically challenging thing. I just wondered when you wrote that, did you think, great, horses, stagecoaches, things like that, or did you?
Yeah. I'll tell you what I did do. Which is what I often do, is write down what the optimum of what I absolutely want. Knowing that, I've got 2 stagecoaches, 10 horses. We had a cow that day that ran off. 200 extras, and then knowing at the end of the process it'll probably be half a carriage, 3 horses and 10 extras. But the fantastic thing about that was that we did end up with what I asked for.
You got 200 essays?
Yeah.
Oh. This is really annoying me now. I'm just thinking, I'm going back to the BBC and finding out where you get all that money from.
I had a very good producer as well who prioritised. We said this is the opening of the show. It's got to look good. We can't make it look like we ran out of money as the show started. so I had a very good producer who knew how to use the budget where. Okay.
So let's. I'm really hoping that this next clip looks cheaper, so here's another clip from Gentleman Jack. I've never seen a greater advert for decimalisation of our currency than that. Can you just talk a little bit about the genesis of the project? You mentioned earlier that you kind of knew about Anne Lister. Anne Lister being the protagonist of the series Gentleman Jack, who's a real historical figure. How did you get excited and develop the idea from a given starting point?
Well, as I say, I'd known Shibden Hall because I come from Halifax and I grew up in Halifax, and Shibden Hall was there, and it was somewhere you were taken as a child by your parents as a day out, or the school. You know, we would go from school as a project, and I think during the 1990s, I started to become aware that this quite transgressive woman had owned Shibden Hall, which surprised me because I thought I knew a lot about Shibden Hall. And then it transpired that 200 years ago, this extraordinary woman had owned it. But it was very hard to find out anything about her. And I think Halifax had hushed her up over the years and certainly not respected her memory, even though she was a great figure in the town because she was a great landowner. She sank her own coal mines. There were reasons why her memory should be very well respected, and it just wasn't.
Was it that, so, you know, when you went on these visits from school, there was an official version of her that was being presented, and big gaps that intrigued you? Or?
Well, kind of not even that. I mean, there's a portrait of Anne Lister in Shibden which has always been there, but there was never any literature about her. There was like a passing reference that she once owned it in the literature at the hall. But in the 1990s, I don't know why, and I can't even remember the first time I heard her name, but there was a sort of increasing awareness of her. And I think it was in 1988, Helena Whitbread published first extracts from the journal. Anne Lister's journals are huge. There are 27 volumes. A sixth of it is written in a secret code that she devised, in which she outlined, goes into great detail, in fact, about her relationships with other women. And so the first extracts from the journal were published in 1988. I wasn't aware of that at the time, but I think that's why through the 90s there was an increasing awareness sort of in the ether of who she was, because this book was out there, even though I didn't know about it. And then I asked a friend of mine, Tabitha, who's here today, in fact, if she could do some research for me about Anne Lister, because I was living in London at the time. This is pre-internet, so you couldn't just press a button and find things out. So I asked Tabitha if she'd keep an ear out for anything about Anne Lister in Halifax. And oddly, it turned out that Tabitha's mum had been at Greenham Common with Jill Liddington, who published a book about Anne Lister in 1998 called Female Fortune. So Tabitha sent me a copy. And that was my first real big hit of who Anne Lister was, my first big introduction to Anne Lister. And it kind of became my Bible. I mean, I've even got a copy of it in my bag here today. You know, I never stopped reading it. It's a book that had such a big effect on me. And it was my first really big hit of just who she was. And right from reading it in 1998, I wanted to dramatise. I wanted to do something about her. So it's taken me 20 years to get this on screen. But I'm glad it's taken that long, because I can now read the diaries. I now read the code. And there's so much to read.
Tell me about this code. How was the code cracked, or did Anne Lister want the code to be cracked and therefore left clues?
I don't think she consciously wanted it to be cracked. She died unexpectedly, prematurely, in 1840, and so there was no. She didn't ever try and destroy her journals, and she left no notes to the effect that they should be destroyed. So there's an idea that she didn't want them to be destroyed after her death. When she died, her wife, Anne Walker, inherited Shibden. And then when Anne Walker died, the estate reverted to the wider Lister family, so a distant Welsh Lister, cousin of Anne Lister's, inherited Shibden Hall. And he was called Dr. John Lister. And it was his son, who then inherited Shibden, also called Dr. John Lister, who found the journals. They'd been kind of hidden in panelled walls at Shibden. he started to read them, and of course he couldn't read the coded bits, he could only read the plain hand, and he found them fascinating. He was a very keen historian. He was also a great philanthropist and a great socialist, unlike Anne Lister, who was a great Tory. And he started to publish in the local newspaper extracts from the journals because he thought it was a really interesting, vivid picture of life in the town, what was then 70, 80 years ago, prior to him. So he was around about in the 1890s. And but of course he was fascinated by the code. So he asked a friend who had a mathematical mind if he would look at the code and see if he could work anything out about the code. And together they sat down and tried to work it out. And they had a little bit of luck in that they found a fragment where she'd mixed plain hand with code, which she never normally did. And it said, "In God is my," and then 4 symbols, and those 4 symbols were hope. So they'd worked out, they were fairly certain, I think, of the vowels, which the O and the E, which are 5 and 3. And from that one fragment, they were able to decipher the rest of the alphabet. And it's what's called a simple substitution cipher. So once you've worked out a symbol, that's it. It doesn't alter. So they were then able to read the coded parts of the journal, and when they realised what they were reading, which was very explicit sexual encounters she'd had with other women, the friend, Arthur Burrell, advised John to burn the journals. Because at that time male homosexuality was illegal, and female homosexuality was so unimaginable that it wasn't even illegal, it was sub-illegal. So it was.
Isn't there I don't know whether it's true, but there's the story that Queen Victoria said that she couldn't imagine that women would do that, therefore she refused even to sanction a law.
I've heard that too. I don't know whether it's true or not, but it kind of typifies the attitude, doesn't it? Arthur Burrell advised him to burn these because it was criminal content. It was considered to be criminal. But John, because he was such a keen historian, he couldn't bring himself to do that. He, at some deeper level, felt that was a wrong thing to do. But he hid the journals away again. And then he died in 1930, I think, or 1929. And he left Shibden Hall to the people of Halifax. And so the local librarian and his daughter were sent in to archive all the Shibden papers, and there were a lot. Shibden was just stuffed full of old documents. It was built in 1452, so there were huge amounts of old documents going back all that time. And they found the journals, which were just a part of everything they found there. But it became the jewel in the crown, obviously, the journals. And in 1930, Muriel Green, who was the librarian's daughter, who was also a librarian, she started to decode the diaries as well. Okay. She realised what she was looking at, and they were hidden away again. And they stayed there in the Halifax archives till 1988 when Helena Whitbread went in. Helena Whitbread was a teacher, and she was looking for a project for her degree, a second degree, I think. So she went into the archives and asked if there was anything of interest that she could look at locally. And they said, "Oh, do you want to look at the Anne Lister journals?" So Helena went in. She was given the code which Arthur Burrell had created in 1895, and she started to decode the journals. And unlike everybody else, she realised it was not only very interesting, but of interest to other people too. So she then published I Know My Own Heart and No Priest But Love. And that's how the journals became more widely known to the public. So slowly since 1988, when Helena published, people have become more and more aware of Anne Lister, to the point now where hopefully she's globally well-known.
It's for someone who tried to keep her secrets in code, it seems to have gone wrong now for her. It's
a really interesting question, though, because I often get asked, would Anne Lister secretly have wanted these things to be known? And she bought a very good quality paper. She bought paper that would last, and I think she was a super intelligent woman. She was highly intelligent, and you do wonder if she had some. She was also very nousy. She had an odd kind of intelligence. She wasn't at all nerdy. There was some, she really engaged with the world, and she had this super intelligence. And you do wonder if she had some sense that one day this would, be seen in a very different way, in the way that we indeed do see her in a very different light now.
Yeah, I suppose if she's chosen to use code, then that presupposes in her thinking that there's a possibility that other people will read it. Because if the rest of the world doesn't exist and no one can read it, then you don't need to put it in code. That's just creating work for yourself. I think it's fascinating that the journey that the diaries have gone on, and also possibly if she hadn't written the more explicit sections in code, then possibly there would have been a greater likelihood that the diaries would have been destroyed. That if people actually saw this, the brazen language. So it's an extraordinary journey, as you say, of this voice from the past. Before we go on, let's see another clip from Gentleman Jack. I have to say, I detect that you're very kind to your continuity person. You've got a whole table full of food and no one's actually doing any complicated eating that has to be repeated across the takes.
I know. Well, I hate that. I try to get people to do complicated stuff. Because I hate it when it looks like actors aren't eating.
Oh, yeah. So
that's quite rare. Actually, in Gentleman Jack, often they're doing quite eaty stuff, complicated stuff across the table. Because it is one of my pet hates on telly when people just push food around the plate like that. Or maybe that's what actors do in real life. I don't know.
So in terms of the relationship between the diaries and the character you created, what was that process? Did you attempt to be as faithful as possible to the voice that came from the past, or did you make an interpretation based on how honest and self-aware the real person was, or was it more that you felt that there were dramatic imperatives that therefore gave you license to move on?
I wanted to be as authentic as I could. I really wanted to present Anne Lister as in a way that she would recognise. But at the same time, I was very conscious of wanting to entertain a modern audience. So it was trying to find a balance that a modern audience would understand and accept and enjoy, but they would also feel was giving them an insight into the past. So as often as I could, I would use her language. I might change the odd word to make it more accessible, but on the whole, I think it is very much in her speak, the whole thing. It was an incredibly, I think it's probably the hardest thing to write I've ever done in terms of how time-consuming it was. I can normally write an episode of Happy Valley or Last Tango in a month, 4 weeks. I allow myself 4 weeks. I've got it down to a fortnight before now.
Is that the draft, or is that storylining plus draft?
Yeah, storylining plus a first draft, which I hope will end up being the shooting script.
So while we're talking about that, in terms of that process, does anyone see your storyline, or do you storyline?
Yeah, I send it to my exec and my script editor, and then they will feed back any notes, and then I either incorporate it or not, depending how I feel, and then I'll write the script. From a very detailed, I do a really detailed scene breakdown. I'll write like 10 pages of scene breakdown, because I think that's where you crack all the problems, and then you can just go for it with the dialogue. With Gentleman Jack, it was a very different process. So as I say, I would normally allow myself 4 weeks to write one episode of a contemporary show. With this, it was taking me 2 months, particularly at the beginning of the process, because I'd have to transcribe the journal, first of all, and then read it, which are actually two separate parts of your brain, weirdly. So often when I'd read what I'd transcribed, I'd be finding things out that I hadn't realised when I was transcribing it, particularly when you're transcribing the code, because it's, you are literally doing it letter by letter. There are no breaks in the words, so it's one long, it's almost literally stream of consciousness. So transcribing, reading, and then turning it into drama. And this isn't a novel with a beginning and a middle and an end. It's not like there's a suggested storyline. It's a diary, which is often very random and erratic. So it became quite a laborious process. Fascinating and enjoyable, but laborious at the same time. And the hardest thing was what to leave out. It's so rich, the journal, it's so dense, and it's also fascinating. The hardest thing was what to leave out. And it's really odd watching it now, because I've just begun work on season 2, so I'm back in the journals for the next part, and watching what we've shot for season 1. And it's made me realise just how much I've had to leave out. And so my portrait of Anne Lister and what I read in the journal they're two separate beings. And it's weird, because I think what surrounded is extraordinary. I think she brought something phenomenal to this performance that I've never quite seen her do before, and I've worked with her quite a few times. But I think it just makes you realise it's impossible to dramatise a real human being when they've put so much about themselves and their thoughts down on paper. It's so detailed. How do you truly dramatise a real human being in all that complexity? And I think I've had a fair crack at it, but there's a lot missing too. I think you could make 100 films about Anne Lister. You could certainly make a film about the diaries and how they were buried and hidden and rediscovered and that kind of thing. But it's a unique. She was a unique person, and her diaries are a unique thing. And to try and dramatise them, I realise is, now I've done it, is actually probably impossible. But I hope other people.
I think you're just saying that to put anyone else off.
I'm
So
not.
that you've just got this territory for yourself.
I think it's the opposite. I think I'd love other people to read them, and I'm sure they could do. As I say, you could do 100 different interpretations of Anne Lister, and they would all be accurate because there was so many facets to who she was.
In the fact that series 1 has been on air, and you just said that you're working on series 2, it's been recommissioned, which is great and entirely expected. It's been an enormous success. In terms of your process of constructing a second season, did you study the reactions to the first season? Did you kind of scrutinise the things people were saying as a guide for yourself, or do you shut all that out?
I don't shut it out. I want to be quite, I want to listen to good comments and try and shut out anything that I feel isn't helpful. Again, I want to be guided by the journal. I want to be true to the journal. I want to look at what went well in the first series and what worked. We were quite nervous about some of the choices we made. Speaking to camera, we didn't know how well that would work. I think it's one of those devices that can either work really well or just really go wrong. And I think we were quite nervous about overusing it, and so we were quite thoughtful about just how often we did and didn't use it. The audience seemed to have responded to that really well. For me, it was always it was like reading the journal. It was like her speaking straight to you, so it felt justified. It didn't feel glib. It didn't feel like we were doing it just as a gimmick. It felt that there was a definite reason for doing it like that. And because we were quite cautious, making sure we only allowed it, we only used it in the. I always shot 2 versions. I always shot one version where she speaks to camera, and one version where she doesn't. And then in the edit, we made those choices about whether we felt they really landed or not. In terms of audience reaction and how I respond to it going into a second season, you just become more aware that there are people out there who are engaging with it. And one of the things that really overwhelmed me that I didn't anticipate was the emotional reaction that we've had, which I've never quite experienced before, even with something like Happy Valley that was very successful. I don't think it had such an emotional response as this has had. I now know there are a lot of people out there who feel very energized by it and are having a real emotional response. And I don't want to. I got into a lot of trouble in Last Tango and I killed Kate off. I upset a lot of people. I need to be careful going forward that I don't. The unfortunate thing is that Anne Lister did die in the end, you know. So
I think that's no surprise given when she lived.
This is the thing, you know. People have to understand that.
Yeah. But how do you?
Well, I don't know though. In telly, maybe I don't. Yeah. Maybe she doesn't need to die. Maybe she can live forever. You know.
Yeah. I'm interested in what you said about kind of audience reaction. What's your contact with the audience? You said people said this and people said that. Is that things people say to you directly, or are you reading reviews, or are you looking at social media, or are you looking at the audience research?
It's Twitter.
Really?
Yeah.
It's Twitter?
Yeah.
Oh, Sally, don't look at Twitter.
Why are they all mad?
Well, no, I just think, apparently the Earth's flat, vaccines give people diseases. Don't look at Twitter.
No, I think, I don't do Instagram. Maybe I should.
I was trying to push you more towards the audience research. I mean,
I see.
Because this is my opinion.
The response on Twitter is what I look at, and it's been an intelligent response. I'd say it's been quite an emotional one, but it hasn't been a silly one. I don't think. I think it has been a genuinely intelligent response. I mean, there's one website that's trying to raise money now for a proper memorial stone for Anne Walker, because Anne Walker hasn't got a burial stone, because there was a conscious effort to obliterate her from history because of what she did, marrying another woman. And so there are people online now trying to raise money to commemorate her memory respectfully. So I think that's an intelligent, emotional response. So.
No, that is good. No, I mean, obviously I'm being cynical about Twitter, because you kind of look at the ratios that then often the positives vastly outweigh the negatives, but it's just the fact that you get some opinions within an echo chamber of social media, which then seem to be more prominent. And if there is something that is leading you in a certain direction because of social media commentary, then it's always useful to look at the audience data, look at the AIs and all that, just to think, is this a real phenomenon, or is it just social media?
Oh no, anything can look like a phenomenon if you look at. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so let's move on and look at an earlier piece of work. This is a clip that we're going to show from To Walk Invisible, please.
That was a good example, actually, of not listening to Twitter, because somebody tweeted in, twat, whatever you call it, Sally Wainwright couldn't have found 3 women who looked less like sisters if she'd tried. And I really did try. You know, there are really clear descriptions of the Bronte sisters. Charlotte was 4'10" and Emily was 5'10". So obviously that's an example of somebody on Twitter giving a very glib response. So yes.
No, I think someone on Twitter accusing someone of laziness as if making a TV program is easier than spending 3 seconds writing an abusive message. Sorry, is my negativity about Twitter coming through? I was just going to say, look, it's great fun shooting with drones, isn't it?
Yeah.
Don't you just love it?
I love them. Yeah.
I'd shoot everything with drones if I could.
Yeah.
So this is a piece with certain parallels, because real historical figures set in the olden days. Was that the first period?
Yes, that was the first period drama I wrote and directed as well. Yeah, it was, and again, the first time I'd written about real people, as opposed to just making it all up.
Yeah.
Which
brings very different. Both of those bring challenges. I mean, obviously, we're so used as writers to thinking, being able to imagine the world around our character, the infrastructure of the world in which mobile phones exist and people talk in a certain language, and then you always find yourself thinking, oh, did they say that in the olden days?
Yeah.
And how does this work? Did they have machines? That kind of thing. How did you approach that?
Well, because it's telly, you do expect an immediacy, and I often try and bypass things. I wrote a scene in Gentleman Jack where Anne Lister is exchanging letters with one of her lovers, Mariana Lawton, and I made it like a phone call. It was the beginning of episode 6, so it will have been on in England now. And I cut it, and, well, I didn't cut it, I didn't direct it, but I wrote it to be cut, like a phone call. So I think, it hopefully that gave it an immediacy and a joy and a bit of fun. In terms of language, again, with the Bronte sisters, I tried to use language that I knew they'd used in their novels. So it was trying to attempting to create a version of them that they would hopefully recognise, whether they would or not, who knows, but one that was sufficiently accessible to a contemporary audience. And you do find all sorts of things out that are surprising, like words that I was accused of using language by somebody who was slightly less lazy, wrote a letter to the Radio Times, that I'd used language that they wouldn't have used. Trash. Charlotte often used to say something was trash, and she did. I didn't invent that. She uses trash to mean something's rubbish, which we think sounds very American, but she was using it. And I also had Branwell using the F word in To Walk Invisible, which what the letter in the Radio Times was about. Branwell wouldn't have used the F word, which is rubbish. Just because it doesn't appear in the novels, it doesn't mean that they didn't use this Anglo-Saxon word in the 1840s.
I mean, how do you react to a comment like that? I mean, someone's making something up and then presenting it as a criticism. Does that? I mean, because you're reading that and you're talking about it now. What effect does that have on you?
To be honest, it just makes me laugh. I think I've got good instincts about when somebody makes a criticism and you should listen to it, and when they make a criticism and you just go, you're just wrong.
Yeah, just wrong. Yeah. Yeah. So now that we've convinced everyone that you write sort of rural period drama, we need to disabuse people of that, and let's see an amazing clip from one of your most successful series. This is Happy Valley.
That wasn't the clip I was expecting. Never mind.
Yeah, me neither. But it's interesting that openings are so distinctive in the way that you approach them. In both Series 1 and Series 2 of Happy Valley had incredibly imaginative openings, yet you were able to reveal a lot about character and setting. And what was the process there in terms of the two series and starting them off? How did you conceive how you wanted to start and where you were heading?
Well, that was the opening of Series 2, and I thought we were going to show the opening of Series 1, in which Catherine just tells the audience exactly who she is and what her background is, because she's talking to a man who's trying to set himself on fire. So she tries to bring him down by telling him about herself. And both that and the clip you've just seen were anecdotes that my police advisor told me about things she'd done. So I made a very conscious decision to open both series with two of the most dramatic true life incidents that Lisa had to deal with, Lisa, my police advisor. So the first one was her talking down a suicide victim, and how part of the technique of talking a suicide victim down is you talk about yourself. You engage with them, that you allow them to see you as a human being. So if they do this terrible thing in front of you, they're less likely to, because they know who you are, and they know that, it's that empathy thing of they can't do it in front of someone who's now their friend. So it's one of the techniques that they use to try and stop people, doing something extreme like that. So that immediately struck me as something I'd love to dramatise. So that informed the opening of season 1. And then in season 2, it was just an anecdote Lisa told me that had stayed with me, where she'd had to stone a sheep to death because it was in such a bad way that it couldn't be fixed. It couldn't be, a vet couldn't do anything for it. A vet couldn't get there for another 4 hours. So the only humane thing she could do was kill it. And that was the only means available to her, was a coping stone off a wall. So there were just two surprising anecdotes that I personally would have never imagined, and I thought the audience would similarly feel captivated and stimulated by. Entertained is possibly the wrong word, but.
So Happy Valley features this protagonist who is a uniformed police officer who's very much part of her community. And in many ways it's so distinctive as a series, because there is that sense of community in it. There is a sense of the protagonist being connected to her world in a way that's very different from a lot of procedural police series. What was your inspiration and your objective in conceiving Happy Valley?
Well, first of all, I'd written a drama called Scott and Bailey for ITV, which had been quite successful, and then the BBC came to me and they basically wanted a cop show that was going to be as successful as Scott and Bailey. So
they came to you. They said, "Please, can we?"
Can you do us? Yeah, they said, "Can you do us a cop show?" Which again, I was worried about getting pigeonholed. I don't want to become somebody who does cop shows.
That just tells me how imaginative television executives are. It's like, we've got one of our most talented writers. What can we get her to do? A cop show.
Yeah, I know. It's typical, isn't it? Oh well. Well, and that's another thing. It makes you go, well, how can I do a cop show that is unlike any other cop show that's ever been before? So rather than do the obvious Scott and Bailey on BBC, I decided what can obviously make it different, and that was uniformed police rather than detectives. I also knew I wanted to write something else for Sarah Lancashire, because she'd played Caroline by then in Last Tango, which we're going to show a clip of later. So that was another bit of inspiration for me, wanting to write something for Sarah. And then the biggest thing was I saw a documentary called Walk Away and Live by, I can't remember, I think he's called Jez Lewis, who's the director, producer of this documentary. And he grew up in Hebden Bridge, where the show is set. And I think he's in his mid-40s now. And it was a documentary about his contemporaries who'd grown up in Hebden, and who an unusual number of them had died prematurely from drugs and alcohol abuse. And so he was making a documentary about how in the town, Hebden, it's a curious town, it's a really beautiful town in West Yorkshire, and it's a lot of people go and live there from the south, and it's quite an artistic community, but also the sort of indigenous community are people whose ancestors worked in mills when there was the influx of population to work in the towns, and now there's a lot of people growing up there who have no work, and so he was making a documentary about how he felt people's lives had become rather aimless in these little towns and villages in that area. And it was a really moving documentary. It was really extraordinarily touching, and it made a really profound impression on me. And it made me want to ask who fuels that, who allows people to have such easy access to drugs and that kind of thing, and who does something about it, which people actually try and do something about it. And it was talking to a few police officers where they felt that there just was nothing they could do anymore. It just got out of hand, and all they could do was kind of nanny the situation rather than actually change it or stop it.
I mean, it's certainly true. There's a real sense of place in your work. You grew up in Yorkshire, and
yep.
You tended, would it be fair to say, to set your work in?
Yeah, I mean, it was never a conscious decision to do that. I think it's just something that's happened, and I think it's partly to do with. I mean, I don't live in Yorkshire. I live in Oxford, so I don't know why I ended up writing like that. Except I do think you can get more subtlety and nuance into the way people communicate, verbally and non-verbally. But it's to do with the vernacular. It's to do with the specific mannerisms of language that I quite enjoy that nuance and subtlety. I mean, I've been asked to write a show in America in American, and I actually found that quite frightening because I think American culture is really different to ours, often in quite subtle ways as well as the more obvious ways. And certainly their language is different. I think the American language is it's often very inventive in a way that ours isn't always, but it's not understanding those subtleties and nuances that you've had in your head from childhood. And I think that's why I like writing things set in the north, is that I have all those nuances immediately available to me.
And also it makes it distinctive because a lot of writers don't. So a lot of writers are writing RP. So yep. they're writing a kind of form of English that is their unregionalized language. And so there's something incredibly authentic and it just draws you in. It makes you feel that this is a real place that exists in the real world rather than something that is somehow a slightly remote version of it.
I hope so. I mean, I hope, for me, authenticity is important. I always think reality is much more interesting than anything I could make up. So the more I can access reality as a tool to make things up, the better it is, I hope.
Yeah. Let's this is such an important show and so influential and successful. Let's see another clip of Happy Valley. Could you just, before I open it up to questions from the audience, are you just able to talk about what the response was to that incredibly powerful scene?
We got criticism for showing violence against women. But again, as I was saying about criticism earlier, you kind of listen to it or you realise it's misguided. I thought it was misguided. We'd approached that very responsibly. The way it was edited, my first edit was a lot longer. Charlotte Moore at the BBC asked me to shorten it. And I was really cross about shortening it, but I now think she was right. You know, it made the point just as powerfully by being shorter. I think often on TV we show violence against women and kind of make it a lot, it's often about showing female bodies. That wasn't. And again, my police advisor, Lisa, she was on set all the time we were shooting it, and we talked through it with the fight arranger as well as the three actors involved. And what was interesting talking to Lisa was, I said to Lisa, have you ever been beaten up like that? Thinking that the answer would be no. And she said, only twice. So I thought it was important to show that police officers do put their lives on the line for other people. It's part of their job that when push comes to shove, they are the kind of people who will do that. They will put themselves in the way of danger to protect other people. And so I thought it was important to reflect the fact that some women, police women, will, do genuinely have to put themselves in those situations, and they can't run away. They're not. They're duty bound not to run away. They are obliged to. If someone's life is in danger, they're obliged to wade in and deal with it in the best way they think fit.
Yeah. Also, I think it's about gender balance in drama in terms of being able to create these really layered and compelling female characters. If you're doing something which is a procedural or a thriller, then if you are being drawn away from putting your protagonists in peril, then it means those female characters don't have the same canvas, the same opportunities that a male character would have in drama.
Well, then you're right. It sanitizes what female police officers have to do. If we can never show violence against women, it's sort of been complicit in trying to hide the fact that violence does happen to women.
I'm just conscious of the time, and I think it would be great if we could take some questions from the audience for the last 10 minutes. So, anybody got microphones for that? Okay. Yeah, please do. Yeah, let's just do it the old-fashioned way.
A thriller. My own definition of a thriller. Yes. I tend not to think in terms of thrillers. I tend to think more in terms of what good drama is. And for me, good drama is when bad things happen to good people, or when bad things happen to bad people, really, or anyone really. But in drama, it tends to be when bad things happen to good people, when bad, unexpected things. People are in situations that they didn't expect and they have to deal with them.
But don't you think thriller has a specificity compared to a police show?
Yeah, I don't really think in terms of genres like thrillers. When I wrote Happy Valley, I wasn't consciously writing a thriller. For me, I was writing what I thought was a human drama.
Right. Next question. Yeah.
Hi, Sally. Hi, Jed. I'm Andrew Backler with Avena Media in Madrid. I'm working on a series which is a thriller, and when I get into violence, it's not natural to me to kind of. The question is, how far do you go in the graphic details? There's a point at which, as a writer, you may be afraid of or attracted to the sadism of violence. But do you make the decision of how far to take these scenes? Because, do you show this was awfully graphic? Did you make the decision of how long to take it, or how dangerous and life-threatening to take it before you pull back in the writing? Or do you make that decision in the editing or in the directing?
I think you make decisions through all those processes. Ultimately, the channel will restrict what we have to do if they feel we've gone too far. So in a way, it's our job to push things as far as we can in a way that we think is appropriate. And you do sometimes question yourself and you think, why am I writing this? Because when it gets into really dark areas, and it does affect you. When I used to write a show called Scott and Bailey, I actually got quite depressed writing it because we were dealing with things that are very dark. And again, there was an authenticity involved. I was working with a real ex-police officer who had dealt in a lot of murders. She'd spent her life working on murders, and she used to tell me things that normal civilians never get to hear about. And I actually found that quite dark and depressing, and it does make you question how much you want to push things in the name of entertainment and what you feel comfortable with. And again, it just comes back to instincts, I think. In that scene we just showed where Catherine got beaten up in the cellar, I wanted to show her being kicked between the legs, because we often see men getting kicked in the balls on telly, and it's often quite funny. Don't know why, but it is. But we never see women getting kicked between the legs. And I wanted to do that in that scene. It was in the script. I talked to Sarah about it to see if she was comfortable and happy with it. And the reason I wanted, obviously not comfortable and happy, but prepared to do it, and she was. And James, who had to do it. And the reason I wanted to do that was because her daughter had been raped by that man. So it was a version of that. It was not only as a daughter being raped by him, but he's now penetrating her by kicking her there. And so I thought that was disgusting but relevant. And ultimately we weren't allowed to show that graphically by the channel. So that was an interesting area where I thought in terms of psychological, human drama terms, it was pertinent and relevant for him to kick her like that. But we just weren't allowed to go that far.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, Jed and Sally. I'm over here. Question for both of you, because you're in a similar situation, both incredibly creative people making television, but sometimes you do have to hand over, well, Jed in your case all the time, and Sally in your case sometimes, you do also have to hand over to other directors. I don't think you directed all of Happy Valley, did you? I think you did the first part, and then other directors. So how do you keep those directors in line? How do you make sure that they continue your vision? Because I know directors don't always read the stage directions either. So.
It's your event. I'm not getting into that.
Well, you have to. Well, we're both execs on our own shows, so it's as an exec, it's your job to be across your other directors and to make sure that they are sufficiently engaged with the script and that they are reading the stage directions and that they understand why the stage directions are there. You know, they're not just there in a random way. They're very in a very specific way to be used as a guide. They don't always. I think the problem is with some directors. If they come on later in the show, they're often not as experienced. So with Happy Valley, for instance, the first series, I had a more experienced director doing the first block, and then I came on to do the second block. And then in the second series, it was the other way around. And it's this, when they come on later on, it's the ones you need to be more across, really, because they're just less experienced. So often they'll get things wrong or misunderstand things, and it's often lack of experience. So you've just got to be trying to be really conscious of that and to help them as much as you can and get involved, really. Things still slip through the net, I'm sad to say, which I find difficult. I would love to know what you think about that, though, because I get really upset and cross with directors. But maybe that's just me being a control freak.
Yeah, I suppose there's a couple of things. I mean, one is that I when I'm directing, I find that it changes my relationship with the other directors because I'm not in an overseeing position as the showrunner. I'm actually at the coalface digging rather than being the person saying dig faster or dig deeper or whatever it is. And so there's a certain level of focus that then goes on to your own directing. I think in terms of other directors' work, yeah, it is frustrating if something's in the script and for some reason it's either been omitted or misinterpreted. And earlier in my career, it was sometimes very hard to get a voice in that conversation. And now all that I do is say that it's a collaboration. That there can't be unilateral decisions to change things without me being part of the conversation. So I don't get angry. I'm just very calm. And the other thing is that because we're writers, that we have that relationship to the directors as writers. So that is where the collaboration starts. So then if a director doesn't follow that collaboration through, it feels like that's a mismatch, and you then have a legitimacy in challenging that lack of collaboration.
It's tricky though, because often something will have been shot before you realise they didn't get it.
I know, it's just then what would you do? I mean, reshoots, pickups.
I know. I had an incident on Happy Valley where a very talented director shot a scene and he'd missed some quite salient points. And it was just a conversation we'd never had because they were quite the kind of subtleties that, you know, without the best will in the world, you can have as many conversations as you can. And there are still things that will slip through the net. And so we shot a scene where the result of which was to make Catherine look weak. And the point of the way I'd written the stage directions was to make her look strong. I won't explain the details because we'd be here all week. But at the end of the day, the problem was I'd spent a lot of time with police officers researching exactly how this scene would evolve. It was a raid on an ice cream van. So I'd spent a lot of time with police officers discussing exactly how they would surround the police van, exactly what would happen. You know, these things are planned. They're planned so well. They don't just turn up and start bashing people. They really plan exactly how they're going to do a raid. You know, they'll have a long meeting about it before they do it. So I'd done all this research about exactly how this was to be shot. And then he didn't know that I'd done all that research. I think he just thought I'd written a list of suggestions. And so he did it in a very different way. So Catherine turned up last. She was supposed to chase this guy when he jumped out of the ice cream van, and he actually ran past her police car, quite convenient for her. So there was all these little subtleties that, you know, and I think we both of us worked with the best will, and it just was a unfortunate lack of communication. So I think you can never have enough conversations. It's making sure you're all talking as much as you can between the people, the person who's created the scene in the first place, the people who've given the advice for the scene, and the person who's actually going to shoot it, and the actors. I just think you can never talk enough when it's a crucial scene like that, where there's a lot of action and there's a lot of procedure as well.
I think we've got time for one final question from the audience, please.
Hello, here.
Hi.
I have a question about your choice about characterization about your characters. There is one scene in To Walk Invisible where Emily, just after the scene, when she confronts Charlotte and she's pushing her and she's extremely violent and it's brilliant. And I wanted to ask you, how did you decide to write this in this way and show this violence, which is very true to the characters?
Yeah, I mean, there are quite a lot of accounts of life at the parsonage at that time. Not from Emily's point of view. There's very little of Emily's writing left, apart from Wuthering Heights and the poems. There are only, I think, something like 5 fragments of Emily's writing. But there are accounts by Charlotte and accounts by Mrs. Gaskell, who Charlotte knew. And it's clear from some of these accounts that Emily Bronte was quite violent.
Yeah.
Or could be quite violent. And certainly the evidence of Wuthering Heights is that she wasn't frightened of violence. There's accounts of her beating a dog up.
Yeah, and she...
in Mrs. Gaskell, how true that is, who knows, or who knows how much, if it was true, Mrs. Gaskell embellished it. But I decided to take that liberty of presenting Emily Bronte as someone who, and siblings, all siblings fight.
Yes.
So I didn't think it was too much of a leap.
Well, it was brilliant. So.
Oh, thank you.
Sally, what do you do next? Is it series 2 of Gentleman Jack?
We're doing another series of Gentleman Jack. I've just written series 5 of Last Tango. We are going to do Happy Valley 3, and that will be the final one. But we always discussed it as being a 3-parter. And I'm hoping to write about Amy Johnson, the aviatrix, Amy Johnson.
Great. Well, we look forward to those things. Sally, thank you.
Thank you very much.